Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, what do you make of this campaign finance violation that is being alleged here? And let me throw in also another second crime that Alvin Bragg has floated in court, which is essentially tax fraud. He says that because the repayment from Trump to Cohen was booked as income to Michael Cohen, Donald Trump grossed up the amount in order to keep Michael Cohen whole after paying about 50% in income taxes. And so the result of this, according to the prosecution, is false filings in tax returns, potentially to the state of New York, which he says would be the second crime that would be covered up by the falsification of the business records. But Kim, that's an odd kind of theory, because if I understand that correctly, that means that Michael Cohen paid more taxes than he otherwise would have. And the judge seems to think that legally that is not a distinction that matters, but it certainly makes it an odd form of tax fraud.
Yeah, it would be very odd to actually prosecute someone for overpaying taxes on illusory income. And, this just seems to be another sop to Alvin Bragg, who, as was noted, came up with the idea of what these second crimes might be after the fact to essentially make this stick. Look, to go back to the point about a campaign finance violation, this is where things get really absurd. And as Bill just noted, all of this is so conjured up. It's so difficult. I mean, you begin with the fact that he's essentially bringing charges related to paperwork, falsifying business records. He had to stretch what all of this was because it would have been a misdemeanor. He's getting lucky, by the way, too, even claiming that this is a felony. He only was able to do that because the statute of limitations has also run on that as well, too. And only because the judge essentially said he got a grace additional year because of COVID can he be doing this. But then you look at the campaign violations themselves. And the problem is that they create this extraordinary catch-22, and one that's already been litigated, by the way, in a very high-profile case that had to do with John Edwards, who was a Democratic presidential candidate back in 2008. But here's the problem with these charges. We have a federal law called the Federal Election Campaign Act, and it defines what a campaign donation is. So it explains that a donation is anything that's influencing any campaign for federal office. And this is kind of the basis of Alvin Bragg's argument that this was a corporate contribution, as it were, to a campaign for a federal office, and therefore it's illegal. But the problem with this is that the statute is also clear about what cannot be used as a campaign donation. So it notes very specifically that money is not a donation if the obligation exists irrespective of a campaign. And this is meant to define the things that one can't actually spend campaign money on. So, for instance, if you go out and you buy a $5,000 suit so that you will look nice while you're out on the campaign trail, you can't use campaign dollars on that because you'd have to buy clothing anyway, right? You can't use your campaign donations to buy your country club membership because while it might allow you to go hang out with other politicians and help your political campaign, that obligation to sort of belong to a country club was something that would happen that you would be arguably doing regardless of whether or not you were running. And that also applies here. This is where you get to the catch-22. By saying that this is a corporate campaign contribution and thereby illegally, the flip side of that is that how else was Donald Trump meant to pay for this, okay? Because if he had used campaign donations to pay for this, he would be just as much at risk by prosecuting him by claiming that he shouldn't be using campaign donations to pay off a former mistress because presumably he might be wanting to keep that information quiet regardless of whether or not he was in a campaign. And that was what tripped up prosecutors with John Edwards as his defense went in and he'd been given a bunch bunch of money by outside donors to kind of maintain a mistress he had. And his defense team said, look, we had lots of reasons to be paying her anyway because we didn't want John Edwards' wife to know about this and the political world to know about this. And so, again, that had been private money that had been given to come up and keep her quiet, essentially, that mistress. And Trump's in the exact same situation here. So on the one hand, they're saying by giving this money privately, you broke campaign finance laws. But the only alternative would have been to give it via his campaign, which arguably would have put him even more at risk for violating campaign finance laws.
And to my mind, Trump has another argument that John Edwards did not. This is from the 2011 Justice Department indictment of John Edwards. It says he is alleged to have accepted more than $900,000 in an effort to conceal from the public facts that he believed would harm his candidacy. And obviously, that's a lot more money than we are talking about with the payment to Stormy Daniels, but also that's money that Edwards accepted, as I understand it, from donors. Whereas in Trump's case, the payment that Trump was making to Stormy was initially from Michael Cohen. But in the end, that reimbursement came through and it was Trump's own money being used to pay off Stormy. Another theory that Alvin Bragg advanced in court as the second crime, the thing that makes the falsification of business records a felony. I think this is worth mentioning, Bill, even though the judge did not sign off on it, because it shows how Alvin Bragg is stretching, as you've described. This other theory was that the falsification of the checks and the ledgers and so forth is a felony because Donald Trump intended to commit or conceal the falsification of other business records. And the argument there was that Michael Cohen made the payment to Stormy through this business called Essential Consultants, and he wrote retainer on the paperwork for the wire transfer and so forth. And so the argument there to the judge was that Trump falsified these records in order to conceal the falsification of those records. And to my mind, the judge rightly rejected that as a circular argument. And Bill, it does show, though, I think, to your point, how the prosecution is stretching to try to turn this misdemeanor into a felony.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, look, Alvin Bragg wanted to prosecute Donald Trump, and he found this misdemeanor, and then he concocted all these different legal theories that even liberal attorneys and observers of the law have criticized. And I think in some ways, you know, to take this enterprise seriously is to give it too much credit. I think it's really outrageous what's being done in New York courts, what's being allowed, and even to take these things and seriously answer them. I think they're all fruit of the poison vine. And I think the real victim in the end is going to be the New York legal system, which looks like a kangaroo court. And I think what I'm most interested in is not this year and the election outcome. It's next year when all the appeals and everything will be underway. And I wonder if it's going to look very different when a lot of these things are thrown out as they should have been all along. I mean, this is a case that never should have been brought.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Welcome back. I would second what Bill said before the break, because now we are in a trial court before a New York Manhattan jury pool, and there are limits on the kinds of arguments that the judge is going to allow each side to make in the specifics of this narrow case. And so I'm really interested to see how this fares on appeal if we get a conviction, Kim. And imagine if Donald Trump wins the next election or if he loses the next election. And if this case involves some sort of theory that the payoff was a campaign donation, you can imagine that going all the way up to the Supreme Court. And maybe Trump would be vindicated in the end.
Yes. Look, I mean, I think this just gets to Bill's point. This is extraordinary that we are at this moment, and especially with such a weak and crammed case that had to be rigged in so many ways to kind of get to this moment where we are finally in a courtroom. And the thing that is depressing about it is there's really no good result here for having brought it. Look, I mean, in theory, you would hope that because this case is weak, it's so phenomenally weak, and because of the terrible precedent it would set, that the jury will simply make it go away. But I think Donald Trump's team is right that it is harder. It can be harder when you have a bright blue city like New York to get a jury pool that is one that is more open to a highly well-known political figure, especially one that's on the opposite side of the politics of most of New York. It's not impossible. I'd like to have some faith in our humanity, but I think the challenge is certainly harder. But remember, this is a criminal trial. So maybe you get one juror who's a holdout or refuses. Let's say, though, that there's some sort of a mistrial. Does the DA decide to take a second run at this? Or does he decide it's not worth it after all? Let's say that is a guilty verdict and it goes up to the Supreme Court. Let's say what happens, by the way, too, there's a guilty verdict. What is Judge Merchan going to do with Donald Trump on appeal? Is he going to order him immediately to go behind bars? Is that going to be litigated as well, too? It just goes to show, and I think this also, it rolls over to the other cases that have brought as well. If you look at the Georgia case for conspiracy that has been brought by Fani Willis, just so many untested ideas there, not to mention the circus that has become her personal life and the special prosecutor that she brought in to deal with that case, who's now had to step aside. Jack Smith, again, the idea of the Department of Justice bringing these unprecedented cases about January 6th and the documents as well, too, when such issues have been handled differently in the past. There's no good outcome of any of this, and it really shows the perils of lawfare.
Bill will give you the last word, but to Kim's point, it only takes one skeptical juror to not convict, and that is what happened in that John Edwards case we've been referencing. The jury acquitted on one count and was unable to reach a verdict on the others, and in that case, the feds decided that discretion is the better part of valor, and they decided not to try to retry that case. And by the way, that experience, I can only imagine, is part of what fed into the thinking when federal prosecutors were looking at this same conduct that Alvin Bragg has now charged in state court, and they apparently decided to take a pass on it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Kyle. And I agree with Kim. I think none of these cases should have been brought. The general impulse of the Constitution is to leave the big issues to the voters. Let them sort it out. And I think our point on lawfare is well taken. There's no outcome once you go down this road that's good, whether Trump is vindicated completely or whether he's found guilty and faces jail time. None of it is good. It's going to tear the nation apart. And that's what happens when you go down this road. And I think it's really regrettable. It looks like this election is becoming an Evelyn Waugh novel where out of control prosecutors do unbelievable things. And then Donald Trump walks out of the courtroom and he's trying his case in the court of public opinion, because he feels the courts and lawyers are stacked against him. I just think none of it's healthy for America.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.